In this video, we're going to try turning this messy backyard into one of the best backyards in the world. This young man took advantage of his family being away from home and decided to create a fully lit yard with natural, smoke-resistant ventilation. In this video, he's working on one of the biggest projects he's ever taken on so far, which is building a parallel backyard in a unique way. It's been more than a year since he last worked on his parents' garden, so he decided to bring it back to life. For years, the family has been using this old fire pit, so he thought it was the perfect time to renovate the place and make it blend in with the jacuzzi, sauna, and the other crazy things he has built in the house. He started with the first step, which was measuring the distance. He used a 14-foot-long board with a nail in the middle, spun it around, and drew a perfect circle with a 7-foot radius. After that, he sketched a small pathway to connect this new yard with the old one, doing it by eye in a simple and approximate way. In the past, he could have dug all of this by hand, but now that he's nearly 30 and his shoulders and neck have been hurting all year, he decided to use heavy equipment. And he absolutely loves heavy equipment. They started digging the yard about 6 or 7 inches deep. At first, they tried moving the soil with wheelbarrows, but that was too difficult. So he brought this trailer from his dad's workshop to speed up the process and make the work easier. After about an hour of digging with the excavator, he managed to remove most of the soil. Then he grabbed the shovel and adjusted the edges so they would be precise, making sure he wouldn't have to fix the grass later. Now that he reached a consistent depth of about 7 inches, it was time to install this layer of landscaping fabric, which will prevent weeds from growing up through the yard in the future. After that, the first batch of stones arrived. This yard uses large caving stones along with some additional materials for the foundation. The first thing he laid down was gravel about 1.5 inches thick. This gravel is extremely clean because it doesn't have dirt or small particles, which makes it drain water perfectly. He spread it all over the area here to about 3.5 inches. After that, it was time for the second layer of gravel, but this time using a smaller size, about 1/4 inch, and he spread around 2 inches of it over the first layer. Finally, he used a wooden board and a level to smooth everything out, creating a slight slope of about 1.5 inches for water drainage. Of course, the type of foundation depends on the location. In areas without frost, people might reduce these steps, but since winters where he lives are harsh, a thick foundation and proper drainage were absolutely necessary. No exceptions. Now it was time to prepare the mold where the concrete would be poured to build the natural fire pit. He grabbed an old piece of wood and marked the center point on it. Then he used a thin wooden stick fixed in the middle to measure both the inner and outer radii of the fire pit. After that, he drew the circle on the wood and cut it out with a power saw. Once all the circles were done, he brought in some 2x4 lumber and cut it into multiple pieces of the same length, which would determine the height of the fire pit, around 12 to 14 inches. He attached these pieces to the circular wooden cutout, forming the basic frame of the mold. At this point, the mold had both an inner and an outer part, but it still needed a shell to hold the concrete in place. So he used 8-inch wide boards covered with a white melamine layer. This was helpful because melamine provided good flexibility for the required curves, and it also made removing the mold from the hardened concrete much easier. He cut a few strips and fixed them around the frame. Once finished, the mold was ready for concrete. But there was one last step. He had some steel pipes with a diameter of 1.5 inches, so he cut 4 equal pieces. Then he drilled a few holes into the outer wall of the mold and inserted the pipes, which would serve as ventilation openings for the fire pit, helping to reduce smoke while burning. Finally, he cut a few small wooden blocks and attached them to the frame to keep the pipes in place when the concrete was poured around them. With everything secured, he began pouring the concrete into the mold. He used a type of crack-resistant concrete, which is basically regular concrete, but reinforced with fiberglass fibers. This made it stronger and helped reduce cracks caused by heat. In fact, any regular type of concrete could have worked, but this one was reasonably priced, so he went with it. He mixed the concrete with some water until it reached a pudding-like consistency. Well, more like a really thick pudding. After that, he began filling the mold. His brother would scoop the concrete with a shovel and pour it into the mold, while he went over it with a small wooden mallet, tapping and shaking it so the mix could fill every gap and prevent any air pockets from forming inside. They used about 7 bags of concrete here and decided to stop pouring around 5 centimeters below the top, since they felt the pit would end up being too high otherwise. They left it to dry for a few days, and once it hardened, they removed the mold. He noticed that the idea of adding the steel pipes for ventilation had worked perfectly, though he wished he had used slightly larger pipes to let in more air. Still, it was a good experiment to learn from for the future. Now it was time to move on to the next step, which was the most difficult part: shaping the curve so it matched the circular floor design. In his workshop, he had some cedar wood planks measuring 5 by 20 centimeters. He could have used treated lumber, since it's cheaper, but he simply went with the wood he already had. He cut 3 pieces of this wood, then used a special drilling tool to make fastening holes along the sides of each piece. After joining the wood together, he applied wood glue to bond them firmly, then secured them with hidden screws to keep everything tight and to reinforce the glue. Once the glue had dried a bit, he started working on the curves. He measured the distance to outline the circle he needed, using the same wooden board as if it were a giant compass. After drawing the shape, he cut it with a power saw. He finished cutting all the wood and used the first piece as a template to make a second one with the exact same dimensions. Then he prepared a set of wooden boards of equal length. These were the posts that would support the bench, built in the same way as he did with the fire pit mold. He began fastening each post with long screws to make sure they were firmly secured. After installing all the posts, he flipped the wooden frame over and attached the top surface using the same method. The result was a strong structure that could handle the weight of the stone and concrete that would be added later, and he expected it to last for many years. After that, he repeated the same steps to build a second bench. The next step was preparing the bench for the natural stone. He needed to install cement boards to ensure the stone would adhere properly. To cut these boards with minimal dust, he used a sharp utility knife, scoring the line several times. Then he placed a piece of wood under the cut line and applied pressure until the board snapped easily. After that, he trimmed the backside so the piece would come out neat and precise. He began attaching the cement boards onto the bench, and since the boards had some flexibility, he decided to bend them slightly around the curves. Now it was time to prepare the stone. He had bought the stone from a local company for around 100,000 Egyptian pounds, about $2,000. No wonder, guys, that's why we can't take on these kinds of challenges ourselves. It all comes down to money. This stone would give both the benches and the fire pit the appearance of being made entirely from solid stone. The type he chose is essentially the face layer of massive real stones cut into thinner slices. The thickness of this type is about 2.5 centimeters, which makes it lighter and easier to use as an aesthetic or decorative material. The stone would be fixed onto the concrete using a special mortar designed specifically for natural stone like this. Finally, he decided to bring in a cement mixer, since there was still a lot of work ahead, whether for mortar or concrete, and the manual labor was wearing him down. The installation process itself was simple. He spread mortar generously across the back of the stone, using a larger amount because he was working on a curved surface. If it were flat, a smaller amount would be enough. Then he sprayed a bit of water on the cement board surface where the stone would be fixed, pressed the stone firmly into place, and adjusted it carefully with his fingers.
To remove the excess mortar that squeezed out from the edges, he smoothed it down, and by the end of the day the stones were firmly set in place. The process was like a puzzle, where every stone had to be arranged neatly so that the final result looked natural and elegant. The smaller the gaps between the stones, the better the appearance. For the corners and edges, he had special stones designed to wrap around them easily, which gave a much cleaner and more polished look. He kept working this way for several days until he had fully covered the fire pit and both benches with stone. Now it was time to pour the concrete surface for the fire pit cover. First, he measured the inner and outer diameters of the fire pit and transferred those measurements onto a sheet of plywood, using the same method as before. He then took some leftover wooden pieces and fastened them with screws along the drawn lines. He also had special edge molds with stone-like patterns, which he planned to use as the mold walls, and the wooden supports helped keep them firmly in place. Before pouring the concrete, he sprayed release powder onto the mold so the concrete could be removed easily once it dried, while also ensuring that its color matched the stamp design. After preparing the mix, he blended a few extra bags of the crack-resistant concrete. Each bag filled about half the mold. Then, he added some fiberglass rods to reinforce the slab so it would stay intact when lifted and placed on top of the fire pit. He gently tapped along the edges with his fingers to release any trapped air bubbles, then used a trowel to smooth the surface. He left it to dry for an hour or two, and once it reached the point where he could press down on it with his hand without it sticking, he knew it was ready for stamping. For this, he had a rubber mat with the exact stone pattern he wanted. He sprinkled a little release powder on the concrete surface, then pressed the stamp in sequence across the top to imprint the design. This was the same method used to create patterned finishes on roads.
But here, he was using the technique on a smaller scale, and overall, this was his very first time trying it. The next day, he removed the edges and took off the side mold, then washed off the excess release powder. The result was a concrete surface that looked just like natural stone. He repeated the same steps on the benches and the small table. The most expensive part of this process was the release powder, the stamp, and the side mold. The mold alone cost him about $100. But once he had purchased the tools, the cost for each additional surface dropped to around $20. And he would still have release powder left over to use in future projects. Before installing the concrete tops, he used this special metal ring designed for fire pits. Its biggest advantage is that when you light a fire inside it, no smoke comes out at all. He had bought it online and installed it inside the concrete pit. The ring came in 8 pieces that could be fastened together with screws to form a circle. He then used construction adhesive to secure the ring onto the concrete. The diameter of the ring was about 30 inches, while the inner diameter of the concrete pit was about 32 inches, leaving a 1-inch air gap all around the ring. The idea is that hot air circulates between the ring and the concrete, which helps eliminate smoke entirely. This is what makes the fire pit smoke-free. To attach the concrete surface of the fire pit, he spread some mortar along the upper edges, then set the top in place and measured carefully to make sure all the edges were even. After that, he moved on to the benches. Since mortar wouldn't adhere properly to wood, he used an extremely strong construction adhesive, applying it in a zigzag pattern across the wooden surface before fixing the concrete top in place. At this point, both the benches and the fire pit were nearly complete. The mixture he prepared next was very important because it would be used to fill the gaps. He kept mixing it until it reached a watery consistency, then scooped several shovels of it into a funnel or piping bag. The watery texture made it easier to squeeze the bag and fill all the gaps with this material. The application method was simple. He just spread the material between the stones until all the gaps were completely filled. It didn't need to be perfect, since after a few hours he would smooth it and clean it up. Once a couple of hours had passed, the mix began to set without being too runny. At that point, he used a jointing tool to press the material firmly into the gaps, then followed up with a brush to clean and refine the final look. As for the outer paving, even before laying the stones, he installed plastic edging around the defined area. This helped block weeds and created a cleaner separation between the pavers and the grass. For the paving itself, he chose stone tiles with a thickness of 2 inches, for 2 reasons. First, they provided enough space to install LED lights between the joints, an exciting step that we'll see soon. Second, their larger size meant fewer joints overall, which reduced the need for extra lighting and filler. Because the stones were large, they had to be cut to fit the desired layout. He used a 9-inch concrete saw that he had bought in Canada. It worked extremely well, taking about 30 seconds to a minute to cut through a piece like the one you see here. Once he cut halfway through, he would remove the excess with a hammer or by applying pressure if the piece was larger. After placing each stone in position, he often had to lift it back up and adjust it several times to ensure it was perfectly level with the others. Each stone weighed anywhere from 50 to 300 pounds, making the process physically demanding. After a few days, he needed to trim the edges so they would fit the space more precisely, and sometimes he had to cut entire stones, like the one in front of you here. After 3 or 4 days of exhausting work, he finally finished laying all the pavers. Now it was time for the final and most exciting step, the step you probably clicked on the video for in the first place: installing the LED lighting to give the backyard its glowing and captivating appearance. The spacing between the stones was about 2 to 2.5 inches. He could have installed the lighting directly, but there were a few issues that needed to be solved first.
The smaller stones weren't firmly fixed yet, so he decided to spread about 1/2 inch of the material underneath to secure them and prevent any movement from knocks or pressure. As for the larger stones, their weight alone kept them stable and difficult to shift. After filling the gaps, he removed any excess and then used an air blower to eliminate all traces of dust. Next, he sprayed water over the surface, following the instructions on the bag of the bonding material, which locked the stones together firmly. When it came to the lighting, he was especially excited. He used very powerful LED strips, with the advantage of being multicolored and changeable, not just limited to one shade. Normally, this type of lighting is installed around houses or balconies, but here he got creative and used it in a completely different way. These strips were encased in a layer of silicone, making them waterproof, perfect for being placed under the pavers. He laid the strips across all the stone joints, using about 3 boxes in total, each containing 3 strips of roughly 33 feet that could be connected together. He chose this type because it could be controlled through a mobile phone, the same system he had used in the Doghouse Project video, which was also impressive. Another great feature of these strips was their ability to support the full color spectrum, including standard colors, as well as every possible shade of white lighting. Simply put, whatever color you wanted, it was available. Every 30 centimeters or so, he secured the strip with a fixing pin to ensure it stayed firmly in place and wouldn't shift, allowing him to place things over it without any issues. For the final touch in this project, he decided to cover the lighting strip with special tempered glass designed for this kind of setup. He purchased around 25 bags of it and specifically chose a type without sharp edges, making it safe and smooth to walk on. The glass filled the gaps above the lights, and he hoped it would help diffuse the illumination into a soft and elegant glow. That was the last step of the entire build, and he knew you had been waiting for all of this just to see the final moment.
And now it's time to see the lighting at night. Let's check it out. Honestly, the result turned out far better than expected. The smokeless fire pit worked with higher efficiency than any other fire pit, and it didn't produce a single puff of smoke even after 5 minutes of burning.
This was, of course, due to the structure and the method used in its construction. You can clearly see the flames being drawn toward the ventilation openings where fresh oxygen enters, allowing for an efficient burn. The stone benches also looked impressive, and with the LED lighting, the entire place had a magical atmosphere unlike anything you'd see elsewhere. As you can see, through the app, he could control all the colors and select any type of lighting effect he wanted. Now, for the important question, how much did the whole project cost? Altogether, it came to around $10,000. But thank God, it was worth it. If you enjoyed this video, let him know what other challenges you'd like to see next. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.